Yes, welcome to this training session from the South Yorkshire Digital Health Hub on medical device regulations. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Richard Hall from QMS Consultancy, who's going to be delivering this session today. A little bit more about Richard. Richard has worked in the medical device industry since 1993 and has held senior management positions within new product development, quality control, quality assurance and regulatory affairs. Since founding QMS Consultancy in 2014, Richard has helped more than 80 companies to develop more than 140 medical products, including medical devices, and is named as inventor on 2 patents. So we're in very good hands here. I'll hand over now to Richard, who will take us through the training.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Hannah. That was a great introduction. I've got another introductory slide, so I'll repeat all of that again in a moment. But welcome everybody to this training on regulations. I'll try and keep this as sort of high level as possible so that we can cover a broad scope of work and not get too deep in the weeds. We can hold questions at the end if that's okay, and I'll try and get a bit more detailed in some of the questions if we need to. And I offer a free regulatory clinic once a week, so people can jump on that and ask as many private questions as they want to. So without further ado, I will just share my screen. So hopefully, Hannah, you can see the presentation. Great, thank you. My email address is on the screen. As I said, I donate every Wednesday to helping startups and entrepreneurs better understand the medical device industry. So if you've got any questions that you want answering, you can't find the answer on ChatGPT, please come and ask me. I will do my best to give you a solid answer. Okay, so as Hannah said, I've been working in the medical device industry since 1993. I've got 20 years experience of working in industry. That's 5 years with medical devices, 15 years with in vitro medical devices, and 10 years as my own consultant. For 5 of the years when I was in industry, I was QA and design manager for Bio-Rad Laboratories. And the reason I got design as well as quality in my business title was because I was redesigning the product so that it was easier to manufacture by our suppliers and easier for us to make as a company. And that led to less quality issues and a more efficient company. So I've got a lot of experience going way back in terms of product design and also quality management systems. I've been running a consultancy for now 10 years now. The first 6 years, I was sort of the head of quality in a number of organisations, and I really validated the processes and systems that I provide as a business now going forwards through those 6 years. And now I offer some drop-in systems that people can take advantage of if you need to. And there's a bit more on that on the last slide. I've helped over 90 companies now with 140 plus products, from class 1 medical devices right up to class 3, IVDs from class A to class D, software as a medical device, custom-made devices, and some things called LDTs, laboratory developed tests, which, judging by the people on the call, I'm expecting there won't be any questions about LDTs. But that's where you run a laboratory process and you sample people's blood or cells come into the lab and you test those lab samples and then provide a result. That's now referred to as an LDT. My quality management system has now passed 87 notified body audits out of 87, with me sitting in the chair, and plus a lot of my clients decided to go through without me, and so it's probably passed over 100 audits now in total. So if you need a quality management system, it's a good place to start. I donate a lot of my time back to helping people now, and I do lectures at Imperial College London. I'm an expert in residence at Oxford University, and I do chats like this. So I'm seen across a number of different organisations. Please do feel free to reach out to me, because I don't think anyone gives as much back as me. And you can contact me by my email address, which is on the screen. So to start with, I thought I would kind of focus out of everything. And when you think about medical devices, you really need to see the full picture so that you can then really understand how to use the regulations to help benefit your product development. So this little guy looks like he's hugging a tree there, but when you step back, you might be able to see that it is actually hugging an elephant. And this is the thing about medical devices. When you get into the minutiae, it's very difficult to see the big picture. So I'm going to start there and start with the three fundamental principles for medical device development. First of all, understanding the regulations. It's absolutely important that we understand what the regulations are and how to meet those regulations. Otherwise, it's illegal to even put the product on the market. We do that through design control, and then it's a quality management system in your company that will bring all of this together. And it's a sweet spot between these three sections, which really provide a safe and effective medical device. And that's what we're all trying to achieve. So first of all, starting off with the regulations, I'm going to explain what is a medical device. So where are the boundaries between a non-medical device and a medical device? I'm going to talk about the regulators. Who are the competent authorities? Who are the notified bodies? What does that mean? I'm going to talk about the legislation, so directives, medical devices, regulations. And I'm going to talk about the scope and explain what that means. And that will lead us to the risk class. And through this process, you'll be able to classify your own device. And you'll know which, if you're a high-risk device or a low-risk device, sort of by touchy-feely methods. But it might surprise you where you land in terms of the regulations. And just bear in mind that in different countries, regulatory classification is not always the same. So medical device regulations can be described really in Europe and the UK on the screen here. So on the left, we've got the Medical Device Directive 9342 EEC. So you can look that up. You can download it through your favorite web browser, and it's a free resource for you to read and understand. On the right-hand side, we've got the Medical Device Regulation in Europe, 2017745. And effectively, this is like a contents page for the whole document. They're big documents and very difficult to read, but if you understand the high scale of what they are, you can then start picking out the bits in there that you need to pay attention to as a startup. So I'm going to start by looking at the articles, and primarily just Article 1. Well, it's Article 1 in the directive and it's Article 2 in the regulation. So from the European regulation, this is what it says in Article 2. It says, a medical device is any instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, implant, reagent, material, or other article intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination for human beings for one or more of the following purposes. So in the definition in European regulations is included human beings. In America, they say, I think it's human beings, it might be a different term, humans and animals. So they include animals in America, we don't. This means that if you're developing something which you can apply to the veterinary world or the livestock world, you can still make some money from your device. You can do a lot of clinical performance studies on animals before it's then taken to humans. So you'll get a really good feel for usability of the device well before it gets into the regulations of humans. And that might just save you a lot of pain because the regulations are a lot less for veterinary care. Not all medical devices can do that. In fact, most of them can't, but I've had a couple that can. The following section of this definition covers all medical devices. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is differentiate between what's not a medical device and what is a medical device. And I'm using the definition to define that process. So the top two sentences in the definition can really be used to describe the whole of medical devices. About 80% of medical devices, I suppose, would be described by the top two. So you're either doing diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis, treatment, or alleviation of a disease, or diagnosis, monitoring, treatment, alleviation of, or compensation for an injury or disability. So if you put some context to that, what's not a medical device would be something being used to analyze the gait of somebody for a sports reason. So if you're, these pictures were from the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre in Sheffield, and someone has used some clever electronics and software to analyze the gait to improve football or trainer shoes. Now, arguably, you could use exactly the same technology for a different purpose, and it would have a medical purpose. So if you're analysing the gait of someone with Parkinson's, or you've put someone through knee surgery and you're analysing the mechanical properties of the knee and whether they can bend it as far after a month and 2 months and 6 months, then it's a medical purpose. And for that reason, it falls under the medical device regulations, because in the case of Parkinson's, you might be monitoring, you might even be diagnosing the disease, and with the injury caused by knee surgery, you're monitoring the injury through that process. So if you describe your product and it trips over any of the words in the definition, then by default, you are 99.9% assured that you are a medical device. Likewise, if you can avoid any of those words, you might be able to fall into a different category and sell your product much more easily in a different situation. So when we look at a different technology, this is a muscle stimulation device designed to give you rock hard abs, is what it'll say on the packaging. And if the intention from the manufacturer is to strengthen the core of the individual, and they might even put on there that this prevents back pain, because if you've got a strong core and you do the gardening at the weekend, you're less likely to get injured, then that's not a medical device in the UK or in Europe. But if the manufacturer said for exactly the same product, you can use the device to relieve back pain, then it would be a medical device, because you are now treating an injury. Now, notice at the top line that I've highlighted, it says prevention of disease. It doesn't say prevention of an injury on that second line. So you can prevent disease, but you can't prevent an injury. You'll notice that the US say that this is a medical device, no matter what the manufacturer says about it. The FDA make decisions and publish those decisions, whereas in Europe, we've got a process of writing down in a document, and the document then describes the legislation. So it's a slightly different process, but the Americans have decided that this product changes the physiology of the patient and therefore is a medical device, or falls under the medical device regulations, no matter how the device is described by the manufacturer. Most things other than this would be described under the PPE regulations 2016-425 for things like steel toe cap shoes and helmets to prevent injury. So there's usually a regulation, but it's not necessarily the medical device regulation. If we look at a smartwatch, and the smartwatch might be taking heart rate data and using it to help someone improve their sporting fitness. That's not a medical device because there's no medical indication in that definition. But if you take the same product and you add a feature to it and you put in ECG, for example, suddenly that watch is now a medical device because it's producing a medical indication. There's no reason you would ever measure ECG unless it was for conditions of the heart you were worried about. It's not used generally, I don't think at all, for sporting reasons. I've helped a client who actually uses a watch and a sporting process, but they are a medical device in what they do, because what they're doing is tracking your body's ability to reduce through exercise, reduce things like heart rate and heart rate variability. But their device is prescribed by the doctor for a medical reason, and then it's being used. So that app is actually a medical device, even if it's just doing heart rate. So it really can depend on what situation you use your device in, and what you claim about the device makes a big difference. Moving down the definition, if we're providing information by means of in vitro examination of specimens derived from the human body, including organ, blood and tissue donations, then we are an IVD. I checked with Hannah before the call. There might be 1 or 2 people on the call that are interested in IVDs, but not a huge number, so I'm going to skip over it. If you want more information, then please contact me privately. But as I said during my intro, I've got 15 years of industry experience of IVDs, plus probably a third of my clients through consulting or IVD companies. But you'll notice on the left-hand side that I've highlighted a different regulation. So although IVDs are in the medical device regulation, they're a subset. And so within Europe, which is the only place in the world that I know of, they're within a different regulation, 746. So you have to comply with the medical device regulations and then also comply with the IVD regulations if you're an IVD. The last part I wanted to describe on here was drugs and drug use with medical devices. So a device which incorporates a drug, where the drug has an ancillary action to that of the device, shall be assessed and authorized in accordance with the medical device regulation. However, if that action is principal and not ancillary, then it's governed by the drug pharmacopoeia. However, the EU MDR shall still apply as far as the safety and performance of the device part is concerned. In other words, if you're injecting a drug into a human and you want to inject 20 microliters, then it's really important you don't inject 21 microliters. So the accuracy of the injection is paramount, but it's not principal. It's ancillary. It's an ancillary. You have to consider it if the objective is to get the drug inside the human so the human can then benefit from the drug, then you would consider the medical device as an accessory to the drug use. Okay. Within that framework, we can think of syringes that hold a drug, where the syringe is a medical device, the contents is a medicinal product. We've got some more clever technology these days with nanoparticles. Now, the nanoparticle would be considered a medical device, and actually, in this instance, the tube would be an accessory, and the drug is a medicinal product. And you would argue whether the drug or the nanoparticle is the key ingredient in that process. And the people on the drug side would have one opinion, and the people on the medical device side would have another opinion. But you can see where these combination products come into it. And then you get IVDs, which are in support of drug use. So you get, I can't remember what they're called now. I did mention it before. Companion diagnostics. So you get companion diagnostics, which are used to help control the use of drugs in the pharmacy world. Now, right at the top of the definition, it does mention software. And because of the nature of the hub, the digital health hub, I expect there's a lot of software questions going to come up. And software, when used in context with medical devices, is described as software which is intended to process, analyze, create, or modify medical information may be qualified as medical device software if the creation or modification of that information is governed by a medical intended purpose. There's quite a lot in that definition. The definition comes from the MDCG guidance document 2019-11. I sincerely suggest you read that because it's a really good, easy to read breakdown of what is a medical device software and what's not, and where the boundary is between IVD software and normal software. It talks about processing, analyzing, creating, and modifying software, the medical information. It talks about a medical intended purpose. So let's look at that in context. So the MDCG guidance document talks about software used for storing, sending, and retrieval of patient records, either on a computer or via a mobile phone app. And that's not medical device software. Even altering the representation of data for embellishment, cosmetic, or compatibility purposes does not readily qualify the software as medical device software. So if you've got some form of biosensor, in this case, a watch, sending information to the cloud, which can convert the data in terms of from ones and zeros to a graph so it can be easily read, then the doctor can take action back to the patient. And that process is not governed by medical device software. So the storing of the records in the hospital and the movement of the hospital records is not governed by the medical device regulations. Now, it's extremely important that Mrs. Smith's data is not mixed up with Mrs. Brown's data. However, it's not controlled under regulations. Okay, so it's only if you process the data. So if you were to process, analyze, create, or modify that medical information and the records for the benefit of an individual, it would be considered medical device software. So you get exactly the same data, but you start putting some markers on this for what is considered a boundary of concern and a boundary of high concern, then suddenly it turns from just information that the doctor is using to make a decision to some information the doctor is being informed of, and the decisions is going to be highly incentivized by the doctor to see anything as a red flag to action that. I've got an example here of one of my previous clients who was not making a medical device until they were. So they created an app which collated electronic data from other medical devices, things like stethoscopes, thermometers, blood oxygen meters, that sort of thing. This app was being used on a phone in rural parts of India where the doctor wouldn't call for many months, if ever. And babies could be taken to a clinic. They could get assessed by fairly low-trained individuals using the app and using some basic medical devices. The information is then beamed up through the cloud to the doctor, who might be hundreds of miles away in a hospital, who doesn't see the patient, has no interactions, no communication with the patient, but makes a possible life or death decision on that patient based on the data that comes through from the medical device. And none of that, believe it or not, is medical device software, because you're taking just medical device information coming from medical devices that are CE marked and FDA approved, etc., sending that to a doctor, and then the doctor makes a decision on the information they've seen from that CE marked electronic instrumentation. However, my clients then added a standardized health score. So if you take all this data and you add it all up on a scale which is provided by the NHS, they didn't invent the scale, and there was no clever algorithm other than a lookup table. So a very simple software algorithm that looked up this information, plotted it onto a scale, and then provided a number alongside the rest of the data. Now the doctor is being pushed into a direction. Now, if the software got that wrong and said the baby is level 10, not 42, the doctor would say, oh, don't worry, send the child home. And that would be led by the number possibly. And the doctor might overlook the other instrumentation readouts. So that's why that's a medical device now, because they're processing or analyzing data that comes from those instrumentation. Okay, so hopefully that's given you an overview of what is a medical device. Think of it for human beings. Consider whether it's a drug or is it a medical device. Are you saving the health of people? Are you preventing injury, or are you preventing disease? Are you analyzing humans? And if it's software, are you processing data? Okay, so once we've worked out we've got a medical device, what do we do then? So we need to understand who the regulators are of this world. So everywhere you go in the world, there will be a regulatory body whose job it is to prevent you from putting the product on the market until it's been proven to them that is safe and effective. Within the world, most people in Europe are thinking they're going to launch the product in Europe and America, because that offers the biggest bang for the buck, if you like. That's the biggest market currently in the world. We've got now the UK CA mark coming out of the UK, because now UK is now separate from Europe. It's still a big market, and it's quite a good market because we can launch straight into the NHS, and then the NHS then covers the whole of the UK. I know it's got different sections to it, and it's never as simple as that with the NHS, but in theory, once you're in the NHS, you're in the NHS, and you would suck up most of that 7% within that. Now, just remember, those are global statistics, and your device might sell really well in Brazil, for example, that's not covered by that. So think about where you would want to sell the device. I'm going to concentrate now on the UK and Europe, starting off with Europe. So within Europe, there are competent authorities. Now, these are the highest legal power in the area. So in this case, Europe. There are now 27 competent authorities since Brexit, and their job is to set the rules and to audit the notified bodies. The notified bodies' job is to audit industry and to make sure that the medical devices that are placed on the market do so when they are safe and effective. Now, just as a little sort of caveat to that. If you've got a class 1 medical device, you don't deal with the notified bodies at all. You only deal with the competent authorities. Only if you hit a certain category, do you go to the notified bodies, and then the notified bodies will register you with the competent authorities. There is a website you can go to, the Europa website, where you can identify all the competent authorities around the world, all the notified bodies rather, are in Europe, I should mention, and they're on this screen as well. So in the UK, we've got the MHRA, that is our competent authority. Underneath our competent authority sits 9 notified bodies. So what this slide is showing are the names of the notified bodies on the left-hand side. We've got the scope, i.e. what the notified body will audit against, whether it's a medical device or an IVD or an active implantable medical device, the office number in the UK and the office number in Europe. Now, you'll notice that not all of the companies registered on there operate in Europe, and that's an important distinction, because if you're launching the device in the UK and you want to go to Europe later, it's important to start the process with a company which is operating in both sectors. So a company like BSI, for example, has an office in Milton Keynes, and they also have an office in the Netherlands. So it simplifies the process moving forwards. In Europe, there are 49 notified bodies for medical devices, and there are 12 notified bodies for IVDs. You can get a full list of those from here. So I think on the PDF, these will all function as links and hyperlinks, and you should be able to just click on them straight to the list. When you get to the European list, it takes you to a list which is legislation based. So you're looking for the 2 pieces of legislation, 2017-745 for medical devices and 2017-746 for IVDs. Click on that and it'll give you the full list of notified bodies in Europe. And then what is the legislation? Well, I would separate it into 3 distinct tiers. You've got free regulations, paid for standards, and then free guidance documents. So starting off with regulations, as I said before, everywhere you go in the world, there'll be a regulation that provides a legal basis for putting medical devices on the market. In Europe, it's fairly complex at the moment. We've got the regulations for the medical device regulation and the IVD regulation governing Europe. And then because of Brexit, there is a piece of legislation that was written in 2002 called the MDR 2002, which is based on the old EU directives. So we're still following MDD 9342 EEC and 9879 EC for IVDs in the UK currently. So that's going to change over the next year, hopefully. We'll get our UK MDR. But until that's launched, we're still following the old directives. Now, that gives us a big advantage if we're trying to launch a medical device with software or for diagnosis, or electronic device for diagnosis, or a software device. If it doesn't do diagnosis, I'll explain that in a moment. But there are some loopholes in the old directives that aren't in there for the regulations. So speed to market might be quite a big thing, as I'll show you in a moment. In America, we've got the FDA producing codes of federal regulation according to Section 21. And if you look for numbers from about 800 to about 1200, there is all the medical device regulations set out in that structure there. It's fairly complex, but also fairly straightforward, because at least the FDA put everything on the website so you can see it. It's somehow a little bit easier than the European situation, I would say. As far as standards are concerned, for IVDs and medical devices, we've got in both documents, there is an Annex 1 that talks about the essential safety and performance requirements. And in there, it says that the products manufactured for medical devices need to be state-of-the-art. And state-of-the-art means that you must meet the formal recognised minimum requirement in terms of specification, and that's all dictated by the standards. Now, there are 5 standards which are going to be in every medical device. So usability, 62366, risk 14971, labeling has got 2 standards, and 13485 is the QMS standard for medical devices. Now, together with that, you get the majority of medical devices conforming to a lot of the other standards. So if you've got software in your medical device, then IEC 62304 is a standard to read to ensure that you meet that requirement. You must meet it before you go to market. If you connect that software to the internet, then 27001 gives you a basis for information security. If you connect your product to a patient, you'll need to meet the requirements for biocompatibility. If you've got electricity with the device, then 60601 will need to be met for medical devices that are electronic. In addition, you then get a splattering of other standards which are more specific. So 60601 can spill out into a number of different subcategories or substandards. And for example, -1-11 is for home healthcare. And you've got to find all of these that fit your specific medical device. And the question is, how do you go about doing that? Well, you can locate them on Google and Wikipedia. So you can do some general searches. If you want to know about biocompatibility, put biocompatibility standard into Google, and the Wikipedia link will come up. And generally speaking, that's a really good approach. Once you focus in a little bit more, you can then look on the BSI shop. BSI have invested a huge amount of money in a really good search tool that will allow you to search by term and by standard number, and it will tell you what the most recent version of the standard is, because these standards get updated once every 10 years or so. And if it's due for renewal, it'll tell you it's coming up, and if it's just been superseded, it'll tell you, and it'll tell you what the new number is. However, BSI charge a lot of money for this, so standards are typically £200 to £300 per standard, and you might need to read and apply 10 to 15 standards for your typical medical device. So this can become very expensive. There is a website in Estonia at evs.ee where you can pick up standards for 20 or 30 pounds. They're all written in English. They're effectively the same. There's some little nuances, like 0.5% of difference in terms of what you would see in a UK standard versus an Estonian standard, but there'll be enough for most instances. So I'd recommend you go there. The university will obviously have these standards, and you can source the standards from the university as well. But all standards do have to be paid for in some regard. Then there's a whole heap of guidance document. This is freely available. Once you know where to look and what it is, you can download this and read this. So ever since the directives were published from the first one in 1990, 93 and 98 for the 3 different directives, they've been publishing MedDevs, and there's about 30-ish MedDev documents that you can read to understand the context of the directive and what the directive should actually mean. You can get a full list at the website that's there. The only one that I would say is mandated is MedDev 2.7/1 revision 4, which talks about clinical evaluations. That requires a literature study and a clinical performance test of your medical device for a startup business. And it's important that you comply with that for all medical devices. Even a class 1 medical device needs a clinical evaluation report in the technical file when you go to try and get a CE mark for it. The directives are slightly behind that. So if you're making a class 2 or class 3 device, you'll need a clinical evaluation report, but not mandated for a class 1 in the UK just at the moment. But they're not needed for IVDs. Okay, so just to make that very clear, it's only needed for medical devices. The European regulations have come out, and they're 300 pages long, or getting towards that, and it's all legal jargon, basically. So it's very difficult to read. And so now there's 120 plus guidance documents been released to support the European regulations. There's plenty more coming down the track. And again, you can get a full list from the Europa website. One that I've already highlighted is MDCG 2019-11 guidance document, which talks about software as a medical device and will differentiate between software as a medical device or an IVD, and where the boundary is between a standard product software and what's medical device software. So I sincerely suggest you read that one. And then the FDA have been producing guidance documents for around about 50 years now. So there's 2,500 plus documents that you can read to help you understand and negotiate the US regulations. So just to differentiate between what is a medical device and what's an IVD, a medical device will analyze or touch the human body directly, whereas an IVD will take cells and tissues from the human, put them through an instrument, and produce some form of diagnostic from that data from that blood sample or cell sample. We can also fit software into this category, so we can have cancer detected from a scan, like mammography scan enhancement by software, is medical device software. Almost exactly the same algorithm that is analyzing a biopsy slide will be considered IVD software. So we need to differentiate from medical devices and IVDs, even for software. Going back to our context page or contents page, when we look at classification of the product, we need to look in Annex 9 for the Medical Device Directive. That's the current UK legislation for UKCA marking, and Annex 8 in Europe. I'm just going to concentrate on Europe for the time being when I go into detail, because we're probably going to follow the classification when we get our new regulation. But there are some nuances that if you're close to market, and when I mean close, I mean within a year of market, you might be able to get some advantages getting to market. So going from lowest risk at the bottom to highest risk at the top, we see that the classification in the UK split into 6 categories, these here. They are in 9342 EEC. If you look in Annex 9, you'll find 18 rules. And if you start off with Rule 1 and you work your way through all the rules, you'll find out what the classification is for your product in the UK. Anything that's above a Class 1 product needs the support from a notified body. In Europe, there's an additional category for a Class 1 reusable, something like a scalpel blade, which is now washed and sterilized between uses, but then reused, has a Category 1 reusable status now for the first time. And there are 22 rules found in Annex 8. And again, you start off in Rule 1 and you work your way through until you've ticked off some of these. Now, I'm just going to go through some of these in a bit more detail to put some context to this. When you look in Annex 8, you find that the rules are set out in 4 categories: non-invasive devices, invasive devices, active devices, and special rules. Starting off with the non-invasive devices, if you're not captured by Rule 1, you'll be captured by something else. And Rule 1 says all non-invasive devices are classified as Class 1 unless one of the other rules set out here and after applies. And then we've got rules for devices for channeling, storing of blood, non-invasive devices for monitoring the biological composition of human tissues, and things like plasters, things that come into contact with injured skin is Rule 4. Rule 5 to 8 are about implantable devices, and they categorize them down to the length of time it's implanted for, because the higher implantation time, the higher the risk. So we've got all invasive devices with respect to body orifices, first of all, Rule 5. Rule 6 is surgically invasive devices intended for transient use, and transient use is anything less than 60 minutes. And then we've got short-term surgically invasive devices and long-term surgically invasive devices, which is anything up to a month, and anything over a month would be categorized between 7 and 8. As you see from here, the classification basically increases from Class 1 and 2A mostly to mostly Class 3 by the time you get down to Rule 8. When we look at active devices, we're covering rules 9 to 13. Now, active devices are anything that's powered, and that's not by the human body and not by gravity, but anything else. So steam powered would be an active device, but most active devices these days are electrically powered. So an active device is an electronically powered device, and an active therapeutic device is captured under rule number 9. Active devices intended for diagnosis and monitoring are captured under rule 10. Software is covered under rule 11, and all active devices intended for administering or removal of medicinal products is captured under rule 12. And then rule 13 is all other active devices are classified as rule 1. So just because it's got electricity in the device doesn't mean to say that it's a very high risk device, and it might be a class 1 device even though it's electrical. So the special rules are rules 14 to 22, and these cover everything else, includes nanoparticles in rule 19, which have becoming more prevalent. So most nanoparticles use would be classified as a class 3. It all depends on how long they're in the body for and what their contact is. But it's definitely worth going all the way through to rule 22, just to make sure you can rule all of these special rules out. Rule 22 might capture some electronic devices, because rule 22 talks about therapeutic devices where there's a closed loop system in there. So the software is making a decision and then re-injecting pharmaceuticals, for example, into the body would be a closed loop system. So software that promotes well-being and meditation can be an effective way of reducing depression. But could it be a medical device? Well, the answer is it could be, but only if the manufacturer said that it was. So if you imagine an app that is designed specifically just to record and monitor depression over time, then that information could be going to the patient who's using the phone, or it could be going to a clinician as a backup. Either way, all you're doing is recording and monitoring. And if you think about the classification of this, where would that sit? So we've got this nuance at the moment that in the UK, we're following one directive, and in Europe, we're following a regulation, and that gives us a little loophole. So under Rule 10, in the directive, the UK legislation, it says active devices intended for diagnosis are a 2A. And then under Rule 12, it says all other active devices are class 1. So if your product, your software, or your electronic medical device is not doing a diagnostic function, it would be a class 1 in the UK under that rule. There might be another rule that captures it, like an implantable rule or a special rule. So you need to rule those out. However, on the whole, this is the rule that you should think about. In Europe, they've added 2 words, and monitoring. And so because they've added these 2 words, it covers nearly every medical device that has electronics and software in it. Most medical devices are doing some form of diagnosis and monitoring if they're an active device. And then they've added this 3rd rule, this new rule, software intended to provide information which is used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes is classified as a 2A, except in such decisions have an impact that may cause something that's more serious. In class, you'll be a class 2B or 3. It also says software intended to monitor physiological processes are classified as 2A and 2B. And all other software is classified as a class 1. But I can't really think of anything in my career that's not done something captured by these first 2 paragraphs. So it's very likely if you've got software and you're selling the device in Europe or intending to, you'll be at least a class 2A. So when we go back to this definition, we've got a device which is used to capture information about depression. Then in the UK, this would be a class 1 device. Only if we were then doing some kind of diagnosis would it be classified as a 2A and it would never go any higher. In Europe, because of this definition of Rule 11, we now get a situation where the same software in France, for example, would be classified as a 2A. However, if you are using the information to score the depression, then it would be a 2B. And if you're adapting treatment for depression with the app, then it will be a class 3 device. So really, it depends on what you're using it for and the
the intended use of the device, which is classifying or setting the classification. So you get this situation where it could be a class 1 in Dover, and in Calais it could be a class 3 device. The same device just being used in 2 jurisdictions. So you just need to be aware of that. So that was UK and Europe for medical devices. I'm going to just talk very, very briefly about IVDs. As I said, you can come to me more sort of through my regulatory clinic if you need more advice on this. But an IVD in the UK is currently under the old directive 98/79 EC. If you look in Annex 2, you'll find that there is a list A and a list B. And also anything for self-testing requires a notified body to oversee proceedings. Everything else can go through what's known as self-declaration, and you'd be classified as a general classification, and that covers 80% of all IVDs in Europe before the regulation went live, and it still covers 80% of the UK IVDs. In Europe now, they've got a much more strict regulation, and only 10% would be covered as a self-declared class A device. Everything else would be categorized as B, C, or D. So in Annex 2, if you look at Annex 2 in the directive, you'll see this list, and this is not an abbreviation, this is the transcript, this is copied and pasted in from the directive, and you'll see from here that there's a lot missing. And because there's a lot missing, that's why 80% of the industry do not fit this description. If your product or what you're testing for is described in this definition, you have to have a notified body assistance, or if you're doing self-testing, so someone sitting at home using an IVD at home would need notified body assistance, well, the company would. In Europe now, we've got classification D to B, D to A, D being the most high risk. So you start off with blood screening, you read Rule 1. If it doesn't apply, you move to Rule 2. If it doesn't apply, you move to Rule 3. And Rule 3 is where I'd capture most of my clients. So most IVDs typically are testing for some form of cancer, it would seem at the moment. And so you would be sat as a Rule 3, Class C under Rule 3. In America, the situation is a little bit more simple. They have a Class 1, 2, and 3. If you're a Class 2, you generally go through a 510K, but you don't always. And if you're a Class 3, you generally go through a PMA, but not always. I've got a client in Nottingham University that's got a Class 3 medical device in America, and they're going through a 510K. So it does vary, but generally this is kind of the way forward in America. And if there is no predicate device, so nothing on the market in America that's similar to your device, you have to go through what's known as a de novo process, and a de novo process will cost hundreds of thousands of pounds for clinical assessment to prove the product is safe and effective. And even if it's a Class 1, you would have to go through a de novo costing £500,000 to get your product to market. So work with a specialist when you go to America. It's very important you get the classification right, and you talk to the FDA early and work out what they want to see in your technical file. That's called a pre-submission meeting, and it's definitely advisable to work with a good regulatory professional for going through to America. So that's covered the situation in the UK, Europe, and America. But remember that the world is a big place, and that every area has its own regulation, and you should consider each one differently. They all have little nuances, and you need to make sure that you meet the relevant one where you're going to market the product. If you need more help on this, you can go to a couple of places. So RegMetrics is a company that spun out of Oxford University that created a wonderful website called regmetrics.com, where you can go and you can put in information about your product, and then you will be given a European classification for that according to the new regulations. So not the directive, so it doesn't help you with the UKCA marking, but it will give you a classification based for a European product. Synthicog Limited, we're offering a classification sort of determination on their website for a while. I don't know if they're still doing it, but it was useful because they would cover Europe, UK, America and Australia within your classification. So it was a different approach, and I would say it was slightly better. But last time I looked, I couldn't. But maybe it's worth still having a look for it. If you're still unsure, you can ask the MHRA in the UK, and you can email them at devices.borderlines@mhra.gov.uk. And if you want to go to America with the device, you can ask the FDA at dice@fdahhs.gov. The FDA will come back within about 24 hours, and the MHRA will come back within about a month. So what's the future for the UK? Well, we've got the new regulation coming out next year. They've been saying that for the last 4 years, so I'm not holding my breath, but apparently it's going to come out at the beginning of next year. When it does, the nomenclature for medical devices is going to follow the European nomenclature: Class 1 sterile, Class 1 measuring, Class 1 reusable, 2A, 2B, and 3. For IVDs and medical device software, it's going to follow the IMDRF nomenclature of 1, 2, 3, 4, I believe. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that's what I believe. This is going to get really confusing, and I hope it doesn't happen, because you might be a Class 3 IVD software or medical device software, and you might be a Class 2A in Europe. So a Class 2A and a Class 3 both being the same thing. So it's going to get confusing if they do that. Hopefully they won't do that, but I would not put it past them. So we've covered regulations. Let's look very quickly at design control. So design control within the directives and the regulations are not very well described, or at least they didn't used to be. Now they are very well described. So if you look in Annex 2 of the European regulation for medical devices, or Annex 2 of the IVD regulation, you will see what needs to be in a product technical file for a European submission. It also includes in there information about clinical evaluations and clinical investigations, which are going to be needed before you go to market. So there's nothing about that in the directive. So if you just launched in the UK, it's still worth reading what the requirements are in Europe and setting yourself up for passing both CE marking and UK, even if you just intended to go into the UK in the future. So you're going to be on a journey from when you had the bright spark idea of this is going to be a great technology for a medical use to getting on the market. And I've split this up into 10 segments called technology readiness levels, TRLs. And TRLs were not invented by me, they were invented by NASA, and they're being used more and more in the medical device sense and the medical device industry. TRL 2 is often not done very well, because people are rushing to try and make a product. And I just wanted to point it out while I was on the call that what you should be doing in TRL2 is establishing what the customer wants. So talk to people. Do they want a handheld device or something that sits in a corner of the room and monitors? It might do the same function, but unless you ask the doctors what they want, you may be creating the wrong product. Talk to manufacturers to make sure that what you intend to build can be built and what the simplest ways are of doing that. Once you've gathered all that information, then go into TRL3. Now, TRL3 is proof of concept, where you need to document the user needs, the design requirements or software requirements, and then the risks assessment, do a full risk assessment on the product. I run a design workshop for this very purpose, but you can do the same yourselves. Make sure you document the design inputs, which are described to combine the user need and the design requirements. And that will set the bar, if you like, as to what you're going to design. So during TRL3, it's a very fluid design phase where you're trying every which way of creating the product, and the ones that work and the ones that fit the user need the most will fall into TRL4, and then you'll run a development lifecycle in TRL4 to complete the design of the product. And by the end of TRL4, in theory, it will look very much like what you're going to place on the market. In theory, tested only in the laboratory, but I'll come back to that in a moment. TRL5 is where you would take this validated, this verified product and validate it in a manufacturing setting. And it might just be increasing the jigs and fixtures of what you have, how you were creating it, and creating a more robust product that every time you make a batch of product, it makes exactly the same, and validating that process and commissioning all the suppliers, validating software, etc. Then once you've done that, you can create some products and test that product you've created for safety testing, EMC testing, electrical safety, data security if you've got software, before then doing clinical performance studies. If you did it in this manner, you'd design it in the lab, you'd build it in a factory, you would test to make sure it was safe, and then you would place it on or with a human for the first time. In reality, you need to make sure that when you get here at TRL 7, you've done all the right things. So you need to be doing usability studies all the way through TRL 4. Some of those are going to be clinically based, and you'll need clinical approval for that. Ethics approval to get through this process, but you will be testing it all the way through. And then TRL 8, you will submit all your data within a regulatory technical file for CE marking, FDA approval, or UKCA marking. Then before you get to market, you need to get ready for launch and plan for the distribution process, plan for customer complaints, and then when you're on the market, do post-market surveillance. And that's all required under the standards. Throughout this process, you should implement the right size QMS. So begin at TRL 3, implement another sort of part to your QMS as you go through the life cycle of the product. As part of this journey, you should aim to get ISO 13485 certified. So what that means is you have audits in your company by a notified body, and they come and assess your quality management system. I'm going to explain what a quality management system is on the next section. And they assess your quality management system against an ISO standard called 13485. Once they've done that, they give you a certificate, and your company is ISO 13485 certified. Now, that can be done at any stage of the development lifecycle. You can even do it after launch. You have to have a quality management system in place before you launch, but you don't have to get it certified until you launch. But 99% of companies will get 13485 through this journey, and it may even be an imperative because you might need it before you can sell to the NHS, for example. So your customers might demand ISO 13485. I want to talk a little bit about exit strategies for the medical device technology. So within a university setting, you might find that most companies are spun out of the university at TRL 4. That's typically when this happens, because you sort of run out of bandwidth in terms of your knowledge within the university. So university setting, people are brilliant at doing research and development, but they may never have worked in a manufacturing environment before. So at this stage, you have a different sort of technology need, sort of mental technology need, and you need to have people involved which are good at manufacturing. You can improve the jigs and fixtures at TRL 4 and go into a manufacturing setting, use those jigs and fixtures to actually get a CE mark, and you might decide to scale up, or you might decide not to scale up, but you still can get a CE mark and then exit with a CE mark. Or you might decide to exit at the end of the process as a big factory, and you might decide to run that for many years before selling to make money, or you might decide to keep it going forever. With software, it's slightly different. Generally speaking, software exits at TRL 10 in most instances, and that's because the process of getting software to market is a lot less costly because you haven't got a physical product to build. But it's important to think about how you're going to build the software. So software engineers either build a software ad hoc all the way through TRL 3 and 4. They then rebuild the software at TRL 5 and validate their software before completing 6 and 7. Or you can use 6304 to fully validate the software from TRL 3 onwards. And effectively, you can skip 5, 6, and 7 because you'll do the analysis for that in TRL 4. In order for this all to make sense and to work for software, you need to make sure that you have version control is really important, and the best way of doing that is to have 3 decimal places. The third decimal place is used for bug fixes and keeping the software working. The middle decimal place will be things like usability engineering and usability factors. The first decimal place would be things like the intended use of the device. Very quickly, I get a lot of people talking to me about clinical evidence and when it's generated. And I would say it starts being generated even as early as TRL3 in a very rude and basic rudimentary way. You can't get the product to market without clinical evidence, and you can't get clinical evidence sometimes unless you've got a CE mark. So when you go to a clinical environment and try and do your clinical study, and they say, oh, we only have companies in here that are CE marked, push back and say, well, it's impossible to get a CE mark unless you've got some clinical evidence. In order for that process to be safe, you use ethics approval through the process, and you get a letter of no objection from the MHRA through the process. So very quickly, what is ethics approval? So it may not be needed if you've got healthy volunteers. So friends and family using your device, you don't need ethics for that. Non-NHS resources and overseas research would not need ethics approval generally, but never assume it's not needed. And you'll find that most colleges and universities have their own ethics approval body that you can go to and ask these questions. It's very likely you'll need ethics to do with anything to do with the NHS, whether it's the patients, the resources, their hospitals, all tissue samples. All tissue samples will require ethics approval. The ethics board is built up 50-50 between very high-level professional people and more lay people. The reason that's there is because you've got a full sort of mix of humans so within the people, the decision makers around the table. So they're looking at it from a human factors engineering and a safety perspective. And it's up to you to make sure that you can demonstrate the product is safe. So that's why you need your risk assessment being done for that process. So we've done design control now. The last section then is quality management systems. What is a quality management system? Well, if you were to read the the directives, you'd be forgiven for thinking it wasn't that important in terms of 13485. It doesn't mention 13485 anywhere in the regulations. However, the directive talks about a quality system, and the medical devices talk about a quality management system. Specifically in Annex 9, also in Annexes 10 and 11, it talks about two pieces of information, so the quality management system and the technical file, and provides more data in one of the articles. So the annex will refer to one of the articles. I think it might be Article 88, but I'm not sure. But it doesn't talk about 13485. All of the regulations around the world will talk about a quality management system, but again, they don't name 13485. But 13485 is recognised as the global standard for medical devices. If you look at 13485, there's about 60 pages in it, and about 30 of them you can ignore. Only clauses 4 to 8 are worth reading, really. And of that, clause 7, product realization, is probably the area you want to focus in on, because that area talks about product design and development. Just to give you a reflection of what's happening in America, we've got a US regulation called a CFR 820, and you'll see that these two documents are effectively the same thing. So if you look, for example, in section or clause number 7 of the standard, you'll see all the requirements set out for design control. So planning, design inputs, outputs, design review, design verification, design validation, transfer, usually talking about transfer of design to manufacturing, controls of design and development changes, and design and development files, so technical files. If you look in the American regulation, you'll find it's almost word for word exactly the same. America took what was 13485 in the 1990s and copied it for their own regulation. Since then, 13485 has changed 3 times, but the regulation has not changed in America. By the end of the year, hopefully they will have launched their new regulation, their QSR, and it's going to be even closer to 13485 than their current regulation. So it's a global standard, 13485 is. Now, when you look at it in detail, we've got the contents page here of 13485, and the section I've highlighted in yellow are those elements of clauses 1 to 10, well, 7.3.1 to 10, that go into detail about product design. But you need to think about all the aspects of clauses 4 to 8 before you get to market. Now, that's important. So it says that the organisation shall document procedures for, and it says that all the way through the document. In fact, it says it 33 times through the document, which means you need at least 33 documents in a quality management system. And each of these documents needs to describe the process that governs that thing that you're doing. So if you're doing design development, you need a process. You need a procedure that describes the process of design and development to meet the requirements of ISO 13485. But this is at launch that you need all of these. And just to begin with, you need a number, just a few. So I would make sure you have traceability and product identification locked down within the organization. So what's a lot number? What's a batch number? What's a version of software? So that controls all the raw materials you're using. And design and development and risk management need to be brought in and proceduralized. As you go further down the development life cycle, so TRLs 5 to 7, bring in more and more of the requirements of 13485. In terms of when to do it, I would bring them in from TRL 3 onwards, and the sorts of things I would include in a quality management system are within a standard laboratory. You can think of a lab book, and in the lab book you would document the experiment that you were doing, the materials that you're using, and the equipment you're using, and set an acceptance criteria for what you're doing. Do the experiment, write up the experiment, and make conclusions and recommendations for future work. I would proceduralize something like that so that every experiment is captured in the same way. Once you've done that from TRL 3 onwards, that will support the product and add a huge amount of value to what you're doing in the university. So that's all of those things covered that I wanted to cover in the talk. Just to summarize, I've got you've got to think about, is your technology a medical device? Is it for human beings? Does it have a medical indication? And are you processing software? Every jurisdiction in the world is going to be different, but they all largely focus in on the same things. The things that they drive are driven, well, the things that they're talking about are driven by standards. You need to determine which standards apply to your product. Determine that your product's a medical device or an IVD, because from that you set the classification of the product. Follow a design and development process, and make sure you document your processes through the development life cycle. And to begin with, make sure that you document traceability of materials and equipment and design controls. So final slide now. This is just a shameless plug for my services. So I do offer a design workshop, which is a 2-day workshop where I go into detail about the regulations. We spend half a day on the regulations, half a day on the documenting the user need, and then the client will work out what the design requirements are for their product, and we come back together a second day and then do a full risk assessment for the product. I've got services that support every aspect of the journey, but please do bear in mind that I do offer 1 day every week free of charge for anyone that's got a question on medical device regulations. And you can contact me on my email and we can hook up on a Zoom call to discuss that. Now, Hannah, that should be perfect timing for some questions.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Richard. Just before I stop recording, there is one question I think will be useful for everyone. It says,
Okay.
If data is being collected for research rather than a clinical service, where does it fit under medical device regulations?
So that stands outside of the regulations. The devices that you use will probably still have to go through ethical approval. So you can use CE mark devices, for example, in that clinical research. If it's a new technology being used for clinical research, then you'll need ethical approval to do the research. The research will then feed into a future product, probably, and then you would start the journey. So the clinical research might be at TRL 1, for example, where you're doing the research to see if there is a scientific or medical benefit to using the product. There is another sort of caveat, loophole within that, and that's that if you are a doctor, or if you're using your technology through a doctor, and the doctor is using a medical device or a technology within their clinic and just their clinic, then that's outside of the medical device regulations as well. So because it's under their control, it doesn't need a CE mark. So no matter how Heath Robinson it is, they're monitoring their patients and making sure their patients are safe. And so that's slightly different. The moment they then say, oh, Bob, would you like to use this? And it gets used in the ward next door, suddenly that needs a CE mark on it at that point, because Bob is not the person who created it and may not be overseeing it in the same rigor as the original person. Hopefully that's answered that question.